Inshallah, we have some esteemed guests in front of us here as well, so you can speak to them too. So one of the questions that I wanted to very quickly and very briefly talk about is why as a madrasa? So Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy is a madrasa, and by madrasa in this particular context I'm referring to like an after-school Islamic school for children. And the question is, why as a madrasa do we need to hold lectures on such topics? So lectures on science, on atheism, on evolution, and topics like that. So there are many reasons, and most of you would know the reasons, that's why you are here. However, one crucial reason is the growing gap between the deeper understanding of science and topics like evolution, as an example, on grassroots level, and what is actually being discussed on academic level. So there's this widening gap. And the purpose of this grassroots kind of movement is to facilitate the bridging of that gap between the grassroots understanding of evolution and topics like that, and what's actually being discussed and the discourses taking place on academic levels. And the purpose is to start these discussions and these discourses on such topics so that, something that may have been considered taboo amongst Muslims, we can no longer see such topics in that way, especially after the democratization of knowledge. Okay? Now, the reasoning for this is to open up the discourse for those who feel, and especially from a Muslim background, they feel that their faith is being challenged. So we are going to approach this from an academic perspective. So we're not going to preach to you, we're not going to give you a set of ways of looking at things. We are going to tell you about all the opinions out there, and then it's down to the audience to decide for themselves. Now, just to give you an idea of why as a madrasa we feel it is important for us to have such topics and open up the discourse. So, for example, Christopher Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great, he states that religion has run out of justifications. Okay? Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. On the other hand, atheists believe that nature is all there is, so naturalism. Sharia law is barbaric. For example, Sam Harris in his The End of Faith, I'll quote, he says, "We are at war with precisely the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran, and further elaborated in the literature of the Hadith. A future in which Islam and West do not stand on the brink of mutual annihilation is a future in which most Muslims have learned to ignore most of their canon, just as most Christians have learned to do so." So, in regards to this, we've requested both speakers to come back again. Some of you have already been here with us 2 months ago, and they will be talking about different aspects of either science or evolution. Just to give you a very brief summary on what Sheikh Usman Ali will be talking about is a scientific revolution. Now, the synopsis is this will be a short summary lecture on the scientific activity from prehistory, ancient history, the Middle Ages, through to the Muslim age, to the modern age, with a particular focus on Islamic science and Renaissance Europe. It will address the question of whether Muslim scientists were the harbinger of the scientific revolution. So I would like to thank Sheikh Uthman from now and say Jazakallah, because Sheikh Uthman is also a parent at our Madrasa Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy. So it all started off with just discussions in the corridors, and now we have all of you present here. And also on some bike rides that we went on. Okay, Professor Shoaib, I met Professor Shoaib at a conference at Cambridge University, which was on sacred texts and science, etc. And from there, we started the discussion. And I think it was on Facebook Live that you saw Sheikh Uthman's lecture, and we started the conversation from there. So Professor, in his talk, Dr. Shoaib will be taking Imam Ghazali's theological positions and utilizing them to address the question of evolution from a metaphysical perspective, and he will clarify this and talk about this further. Now, lastly, to finish off, our philosophy as a madrasa, okay, and how all of this fits into the philosophy and the context of our madrasa is this. So, we are an academy or a madrasa which specializes in facilitating the cultural, experiential, conscientious, critical, and creative growth of children through to their later teens by means of a holistic pedagogy, infused with the synthesizing of traditional and contemporary ideas in order for them to have a well-rounded Islamic worldview. And I would like to add that our madrasa, Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy, is a non-denominational institute that is open to all, and even all faith, denominations, and even those who do not hold on to Islamic faith. So we've had some non-Muslims also attend our madrasa. So therefore, we do not take any position in this discourse, and we're not going to side with any position. The idea for us is to facilitate the discussion with all the diverse range of views out there and allow the audience to make their decisions. And on that, inshallah, I would now like to invite Dr. Tuba to come forward, who would be chairing the remainder of the event, inshallah. So, Jazakallah for Dr. Tuba.
Right. Assalamu alaikum. So it's good to see some of the faces from last time, and I think we've got some new faces as well, which can only mean we're doing somewhat well. So first of all, I'd like to just thank Ustad Hamid for even having this event. It's such an important event, and definitely one that is long overdue. In sort of previous instances is where I've wondered about where Islam's views on evolution are. I remember a couple of years ago, one of my professors was absolutely ripping me apart because I said, I didn't have any sort of stand, an Islamic explanation of evolution and where I felt. And he was sort of a very staunch atheist. How can you even accept religion when there's nothing for God to do? We have evolution, we have astronomy, and things are just getting on perfectly fine themselves now. What is there for God to do, and why are scientists like yourself holding on to religion? And I sort of went away at the time and thought about how to answer these sorts of questions. And I remember posting up on Facebook, so what are Islamic views on evolution? And you could hear practically, crickets chirp, because either there was no reconciliation or there was an active opposition. So these are conversations that we were having this conversation only yesterday. It's always quite black and white in that people are either saying that it doesn't happen, the two can't be reconciled, or it can. So I'm really, really grateful for opportunities where we can hear the different perspectives without fear of being shut down, without fear of being labelled wrong on either side of the fence. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Sheikh Usman Ali. He's currently working as a biomedical scientist and works as a senior specialist and section leader in haematology, where he's registered with the HCPC. He's a graduate from Darul Uloom, London in 2005, after which he went on to teach tafsir, hadith and fiqh to Alimiyyah students. He's completed a BSc in biomedical sciences and an MSc in haematology transfusion science at the University of Westminster. And he focuses on haematological solutions to intensive care medicine in collaboration with the NHS as part of his PhD research. So I'm going to pass over to him now. So we'll give him about 50 minutes for talks, after which we'll potentially have about 10 minutes for Q&A, but there will be a larger portion of the time allocated to Q&A. So if you had longer questions or something and you wanted to hold on to them, just remember there is that time as well that you can ask. All right, okay. So okay.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, I would like to thank Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy for inviting me once again to lecture on Islam and science. And I would also like to thank all the attendees that attended this event, as without your attendance, this event would not have been a possibility. So Jazakumullah khair for this attendance. Today, I will be talking on Islam and science as I did in my previous lecture, but the theme of today's lecture is going to be slightly different to the theme I covered last time. The theme of my lecture today will be the conceptual scientific revolution. Now, there's a reason why I've put that in red, because that's what I'm going to focus on the second part of the lecture. So my lecture is actually going to be an interaction between Islam, the Greco-Roman tradition, and the transfer of science into the Islamic tradition. and then another tradition in the 16th century, which is a transfer of science from the Islamic tradition into the European tradition. Now this is the overview of my lecture. So in the first part, I will cover the transfer of science, and then I will move on to arguing the case for no conflict model. So there being no conflict between Islam and science. And in the second part of my lecture, I will cover the creation of a new astronomy, which in Arabic is known as ilmul hay'a, the science of configurations. And I will then cover how did this science then transfer into a phase where it became a phase known as the new golden age of Islamic civilization. So moving on to the first part, it is well known that science and technology are as old as humanity and date back to the prehistorical period. The first scientific activity that's recorded is, as the Quran mentions in Surah Baqarah, verse number 31, Allah Azza wa Jal states, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught Adam alayhi salatu wasalam names of all of them. Now whether these are biological organisms or whether these are some physical entities is a matter of tafsir exploration that is not the theme of today's lecture. But the point I want to extract from this verse of the Quran is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching Adam alayhi salatu wasalam naming and classifying. And naming and classifying are the basics of scientific research and communication. Without naming and without being able to classify and without having a system of, without having nomenclature, scientists cannot do meaningful science. So in order to do science, you have to have a system of naming that allows you to communicate the scientific output. This is why we had Carl Linnaeus develop a taxonomy, a biological classification system, in order that the biologists could communicate ideas amongst themselves and to the wider community. So the point I'm making is that the verse of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches Adam alayhi salatu wasalam naming, that is connected with the fact that naming itself is a scientific activity. Now the prehistorical period is silent after that first event when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches Adam names. However, there are archaeological evidences that point to several empirical discoveries that took place in the transition from the prehistorical period to the ancient historical period. And this is partly because human curiosity led to several trials and errors. And in this way, mankind was able to discover, amongst many other things, fire, agriculture, animal husbandry, manufacture, and use of weapons. Then came, after that prehistorical period, the ancient historical period when scientific activity went into a new phase. And during this phase, all the known civilizations of that time had contributed. Now, I've listed 6 major civilizations: Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, Persians, Chinese, and Indians. Now, the Greek achievement is the most well documented out of all these other civilizations, and therefore, and the reason for that is because when Muslims received science, they predominantly received science from the Greeks because they were more scientific than their counterparts, like the Babylonians, Greeks, and Persians, and so forth. So this is why it is most well documented, because Islam and the Muslim civilization was the intermediate civilization between the Greeks and the Europeans. Now these societies, which is the ones I've listed, they were the first to develop agriculture. They were the first to develop a sedentary lifestyle which permitted them to be more rational than their predecessors. And they also developed writing, which allowed them to not only preserve ideas, but also to spread those ideas to their neighboring civilizations. So therefore, the Greek civilization, their sciences transferred and their knowledge transferred over into the Islamic civilization. Now, this could be directly attributed to the translation movement known as Harqatu Tarjuma, which occurred in the beginning of Umayyad period. Now, it's very important that we realize that the classical Orientalist narrative on this is that the translation activity began during the Abbasid period, which was 750 Common Era onwards. However, when we look at some of the historical sources, we find that the translation movement actually began during the Umayyad period, and it was a well-known alchemist, Khalid bin Yazid bin Muawiyah. And he was a prince, an Umayyad prince, who was motivated by the study of alchemy. And he was also motivated by the study of metallurgy of gold and silver, and the rules of alloying gold. Now, there was a reason why he was associated with the translation movement, and also in the 694 to 695 Common Era, he was also associated with the administrative reform that was taking place within the Umayyad Caliphate system. And that was under Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the 5th Khalifa of the Umayyads. Now this is, we're talking about 60 to 70 years after the Prophet ﷺ's demise from this world. Now the impetus behind the reform that was taking place during Umayyad period was to mint the Arabic dinar and to liberate the Islamic economy from dependence on the neighboring Byzantine Empire. Because Byzantine Empire was a rivalry empire for the Muslims, and Muslims were going through a reform and trying to develop their caliphate system. So now the thing is, at that time, Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah was of some use to the administrative reform that was taking place in Umayyad period. So what we have is one of the famous 10th century biobibliographer, his name is Ibn Nadim. He was the author of a kitab known as Kitab al-Fihrist, which was an encyclopedic catalogue of all forms of knowledge and learning. And this book was written in 987 to 988 Common Era. And it's a book where he's got 10 treatises, and the 7th treatise in the book discusses the transfer of ancient sciences into the Islamic civilization. And he goes through a lot of anecdotes, and there's a lot of detail, how did the Greek sciences or the Babylonian sciences come into the Islamic civilization. So amongst the narrative which Ibn Nadim talks about, he mentions in a small paragraph in that 7th treatise that Khalid ibn Yazid bin Muawiyah was known as the wise man of family of Hakam al-Marwan. So this was a prince. And he was distinguished in his own right, as in he was a scholar of Islam in his own right, in terms of as an alchemist, and was enterprising and full of love of sciences. Lahu himmatun wa muhabbatun lil ulum, that he had this deep love for sciences. Which science are we dealing with here? We're dealing with alchemy. Now, they were talking about the first contact that Muslims had with the ancient civilization, and this is through Khalid. At one point, it occurred to him to pursue alchemy. Now, what Ibn Nadim fails to report at this point is the real reason why Khalid bin Yazid bin Muawiyah is pursuing alchemy. All he says here is that at one point it occurred to him. Why did it occur to him? There is a motivational gap between this occurrence to Khalid to seek the science of alchemy and the knowledge of metallurgy, and Abdul Malik ibn Marwan's internal administrative reforms. So there is a motivational gap which Ibn Nadim fails to report here. And he goes on, he says, for which he gathered a group of Greeks from Egypt who had mastered Arabic. He had then ordered them to translate the books of alchemy from Greek and Coptic into Arabic. And then he makes this significant claim at the end. He says, this was the first translation in Islam from one language to another. So Khalid is the one, the son of Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, is the first individual under whom a translation had occurred from another civilization and brought into the Islamic civilization. Now remember, this is not occurring during the Abbasid period. The Orientalist narrative on this is that there was an individual during the Abbasid period. His name was Hajjaj bin Yusuf bin Matar. Now that's what you'll find in academic literature, and you'll find that narrative being regurgitated. But what we find from the historical bibliographers is that it wasn't Hajjaj, it was actually Khalid. And there's actually a purpose why I'm narrating this, because I'm going to link it to a critique which of the conflict model which is being propagated in Europe about Islam and science. So this will all link in towards the end of this first part, inshallah. So the motivational gap is then, Ibn Nadim failed to report that, so we have to look in other sources where that motivational gap can be filled. Why was Khalid bin Yazid bin Muawiyah interested in translating the Greek sciences and bringing them into the Islamic civilization? So we have here Abu Hilal al-Askari, who was another 10th century scholar, a Persian scholar, who wrote a book called Kitab al-Awail. And in this book, he fills the motivational gap, why Khalid was interested in Greek sciences, and how does that relate to Abdul Malik ibn Marwan's reform. So he writes that the king of Byzantium wrote to him, as in Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the following message. And the message is, you have introduced in your official documents, Tawamir, something referring to your prophet. Abandon it, otherwise you shall see on our dinars the mention of things you detest. Now you can see it's something to do with an economical motivation here. And that angered Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the Khalifa of Umayyad, 5th Khalifa of the Umayyad period. And so he sent for Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And this is the same Khalid ibn Nadim was talking about, who had love for sciences, who was greatly learned and wise, as in he's a scholar in his own respect. And in order to consult him on this matter, then Khalid told Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, have no fear, O commander of faithful. Prohibit their dinars and strike for the people new mint with the mention of God on them, as well as the mention of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and do not absolve them of what they hate in their official documents. And so he did. So Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, under these historical circumstances, Khalid's interest in rules of alloying gold is being connected to the internal administrative reform that was taking place. Now, it's not what Ibn Nadim was saying. Ibn Nadim was, his narrative on this seemed to be putting forward that the Khalid's interest in alchemy is an academic interest. But what we find from Abu Hilal al-Askari is that Khalid wasn't interested in alchemy for academic reasons. He was interested in alchemy for a practical utility which was of benefit to the Umayyad internal administrative reforms that were taking place during the late 7th century. So now, we have here Khalid interested in a particular Greek science. We have Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, who is interested in trying to reform the caliphate system. And that reform and the sciences that were being learned by these wise men of that time led to the spread of philosophical and scientific ideas and books within the Islamic civilization. Now the root is the Umayyad period, not the Abbasid period, as the classical Orientalist narrative seems to be telling us. So these reforms during the Umayyad period then led to, as I mentioned, the spread of natural sciences within Islamic civilization. And these natural sciences then culminated in House of Wisdom, which is known as Baytul Hikmah in Arabic. Now this was a house which was inaugurated by Harun al-Rashid in after 786 Common Era, so about 100 years after the internal administrative reforms that I've just described during Umayyad period. And then in Ma'mun al-Rashid's period, which was in 813 Common Era, he then transferred this library into a public academy where intellectual discourse was taking place between the scientists and philosophers and astronomers of that time. Now the major impetus of this transfer of science, Greek science to Islamic civilization at that time, during the Abbasid period, was the patronage and the commissioning of scientific research and development. That started in the Abbasid period, but the actual transfer of knowledge is occurring before that. Now this energized trend that we see was not restricted to Ma'mun, and it was not restricted to a doctrine which Ma'mun associated himself with, known as the Mu'tazilite doctrine, which was a hyper-rational theological school of that time, which found itself in rivalry with the so-called traditionalists, who the Orientalist narrative tells us are the irrationalists, but actually they were the moderate rationalists. Now, concurrently, while all this was taking place, the Greek sciences, new Islamic sciences were being created within Islamic civilization, which I'll be talking about in the next part. But at the same time, simultaneously with the new creation of new sciences, Muslims, they also corrected the defects in the Greek sciences. So there was a new genre of writing that developed during the Abbasid period, which came to be known as the Shukuk genre, which is the casting doubts on Greco-Roman tradition. And particularly this occurred in relationship to the astronomical sciences and the medical sciences. Now here is the problem with the classical narrative which I've just mentioned. The classical narrative offers Mu'tazila's connection with Ma'mun al-Rashid, who's the seventh Khalifa in the Abbasid period. His connection with Mu'tazilites, the classical narrative connects the Khalifa with a theological, hyper-rational theological school as an explanation for why the science transferred into the Islamic civilization. But what the Orientalists don't seem to realize, and I'm talking specifically of those who haven't read the Umayyad period, what they don't seem to realize is that the Abbasid period was firstly short-lived. It only, the Ma'mun's connection with the Mu'tazilites only occurred for about 34 years. And Abbasids were around for about 508 years. So from 750 to 1258, that's 508 years. And from that 508 years, they only had the Mu'tazilite contact with the state official policy only lasted for 34 years. So it's a short-lived contact. Secondly, what the Orientalists don't seem to realize is that this period was hardly an enlightened period. This period is known as Mihna Khalq al-Quran. This is the time when the Mu'tazilite doctrine rose to power in the official Khilafat, at the Khilafat level, and it caused an inquisition against the traditionalists. And that was a kind of environment where traditionalist scholars were put in jail for holding to certain opinions. Now that's hardly an environment where science can flourish, where people are being put into prison. Thirdly, what the Orientalists don't seem to realize is that in 847, which is 34 years after Ma'mun al-Rashid, because after Ma'mun came al-Mu'tasim Billah, then came al-Wathiq Billah, and after Mu'tasim al-Wathiq came al-Mutawakkil as the 10th Khalifa of Abbasids. Now when al-Mutawakkil came, he reversed the policies which Ma'mun had put to in the official state. So he then went on to reversing the policies such that he went on to supporting the opponents of the Mu'tazilites, which was the traditionalists. So that meant that, during the Mutawakkil's time, which is 847, that's where the most of the translations occurred from the Greek civilization into Islamic civilization. That's when we had the individuals like the three Banu Musa brothers who were in contact with the state, and they wrote books like Kitab al-Hiyal, which is one of the first books written on automation and engineering. And these were three brothers who were interested in astronomy, geometry, mathematics, and they collectively wrote a work. And this was not during Ma'mun's time. This is during the time when the traditionalists are back in power, and Mu'tazilites have been demoted from the power, from the Khilafat. Now, George Saliba, he's one of the professors of Arabic and Islamic science at Columbia University, and very vocal on the ideas which I'm sharing with you today. He echoes the same message which I've just mentioned in front of you, and he says that it was during the reign of the last caliph, which is Mutawakkil, the one who came to power in 847, that the greatest amount of translations from Greek sources were accomplished, and mostly by a prolific translator of the time, the famous Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Now, Hunayn ibn Ishaq was a Nestorian Christian, and he was not a Muslim. Yet, during Mutawakkil's time, Hunayn was the physician in the court of Al-Mutawakkil. So it was a very open environment where the traditionalists flourished along with the caliphate system, and the Mu'tazilas, the hyper-rationalists, were no longer in the equation. Yet there was no traditionalists versus Mu'tazilas going on, and yet the science continued to flourish even after Mutawakkil's time. In fact, there was more flourishing of science, natural sciences, after Mutawakkil than during Ma'mun al-Rashid's time, which the classical narrative focuses on. Ma'mun al-Rashid. Ma'mun yeah. So Harun al-Rashid is the father of Ma'mun al-Rashid. He was, yeah. So what we have here, now I'm just going to show you that the creation of new discipline of algebra. Now what we find is that during Ma'mun al-Rashid's time, which is from 1813 onwards, we seem to, the Orientalist narrative seems to be pointing towards a direction that the Ma'mun was a Mu'tazilite, and because of his Mu'tazilite, there was this conflict going on between the Mu'tazilites and the traditionalists. Therefore, science was only received into Islamic culture because of the Mu'tazilites, and not because, had the traditionalists been around, then such a receival of natural sciences from Greco-Roman tradition would not have been possible. Now that narrative breaks down when we look at the scientists from the time of Ma'mun al-Rashid himself. One of the great scientists of that time was Muhammad bin Musa al-Khwarizmi. Now al-Khwarizmi, he's well known for his contributions to mathematics and algebra, and as we all probably heard his name. He was the head of Baytul Hikmah, which is the House of Wisdom, inaugurated as a public academy during Ma'mun's time. And as a head of that House of Wisdom, he has basically the following to say. He says that he composed his book on algebra to answer the need of men who constantly required it in the cases of inheritance, legacies, partition, lawsuits, and trade, and in all their dealings with one another, and where the measuring of lands and digging of canals, geometrical computations, and other objects of various sorts and kinds are concerned. So you can see the purpose why he's writing and creating a new science, not so that he can fulfill the dream of the Mu'tazilites. That was not the purpose why Khwarizmi wrote a book on algebra. It had nothing to do with ideology. It had everything to do with the pragmatic internal administrative reform that had initiated during the Umayyad period, and then went on into the Abbasid period and continued, so that the Muslims can liberate themselves economically and politically from depending on the neighboring civilizations. So that was the purpose. Here we have another 9th century Persian scholar. His name is Ibn Qutayba ad-Dinawari al-Marwazi. Now I'm not going to go through all this statement, but all I'm trying to point out to you from this statement is that he is saying from here that in addition to, so the employees who were Diwan employees, Diwan is the public office, those employees were highly qualified and competitive individuals. And they had to have basic qualifications to carry out their procedures in astronomical sciences, mathematics. They needed to know about distribution of inheritance, digging canals, trading, and computing time when the taxes need to be collected. For all that, they needed to be competitive in natural sciences. So in addition to learning our own books, which was the traditional sciences, they had to learn these other sciences. And because there was so much competition going on for the jobs in the elite level, where in the government level, in the level of caliphate system, there was a lot of competition that led to the flourishing of natural sciences within Islamic civilization. Now you see what the narrative here is. The narrative is that the receival of natural science into Islamic civilization has very little to do with ideology and has a lot to do with the administrative reform and the caliphate system itself. Now, despite all this, what I've just told you from historical texts, so I've quoted Ibn Nadim, Abu Hilal al-Askari, al-Khwarizmi, also Ibn Qutayba, pointing to one direction, which is that scientific transfer into Islamic civilization was an internal administrative reform to liberate the Islamic caliphate system from dependence, which led to the creation of new sciences, amongst which I've quoted one, which is the science of algebra. We have Professor Franz Rosenthal, who is well-known American-German scholar of Islamic intellectual history, propagating a conflict model through the lens of Mu'tazilites versus traditionalists. So the same model, which is very rife in the European context, that there was a Mu'tazilites versus traditionalists going on within the early Islamic civilization, hence the revival of Greco-Roman tradition. He is regurgitating the same interpretation, which is a facile interpretation based on the historical narrative which I've just pointed out. And here I've highlighted in red the points that I would like to critique. So he says 8th century, but what we've just found out is that it was actually the 7th century, late 7th century, when Muslims began to receive the Greco-Roman tradition into Islamic civilization from Ibn Nadim and Ibn Qutayba's narrative. He also uses Ma'mun in that statement once, Mu'tazila twice, Ma'mun once. But we've realized that it was actually Abdul Malik ibn Marwan and not Ma'mun al-Rashid. So Ma'mun al-Rashid's contact with Mu'tazilas was short-lived, as I described a few slides back. He also says Mu'tazilite, but it was, if we look in the sources, we find that Khalid, the one who translated, the first one under whom translation occurred, neither Abdul Malik ibn Marwan were connected with Ma'mun al-Rashid. He also uses Abbasid rulers. So he points at Abbasid rulers. But we've just realized it wasn't the Abbasid rulers, it was the Umayyad, 5th Khalifa of the Umayyads, not the Abbasids. So Abbasids came 100 years after. Ma'mun came 100 years after. But we're talking about Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. So even that's a mistaken narrative. He says real cause for the official attitude. But the official attitude wasn't the attitude of the Abbasids. That was a continuation of what Umayyads were doing before them. The real attitude was the attitude of Umayyads, which then went into the Abbasids. So again, the reason why I'm stressing on this point over and over again is to point out that Umayyads had nothing to do with the Mu'tazilite doctrine, and the European narrative, which creates a conflict between Islam and science, using the traditionalist versus Mu'tazilite narrative, tries to pin down the whole narrative to the Abbasid rule, when we have just seen that it wasn't during the Abbasid period at all. It was during the Umayyad period when Muslims transmitted the Greek science into their civilization. Now here we have George Saliba again mentioned the same thing. He says, in this manner, the already established conflict model that had been propagated in Europe since the age of reason as a conflict between science and religion was now transferred to Islamic civilization in the form of Mu'tazilites versus traditionalists. Now with this spin, people forgot the real reasons behind why Muslims actually transmitted science. And the real reason, as I've just shown you, was nothing to do with ideology. It was to do with administrative reforms that the Khilafah was going through. So to summarize the first part, and to summarize a no-conflict model, firstly, it was Abdul Malik's administrative reforms that preceded the Abbasids that led to the transfer of natural sciences from Greco-Roman tradition to Islamic civilization. Secondly, Diwan translations. Now, Diwan is the public office. And, there is a historian known as Jahshiyari who divides the Diwan into two. One is the Diwan for the Amwal, for collecting revenue. And that's the backbone of governments then and also till today. So this Diwan was being translated and opened the doors to further advances in translation, which then was continued into the Abbasid period, which started in the Umayyad period. Diwan employees were also more educated class and competitive, which I showed you from the Ibn Qutayba's narrative and also Al-Khwarizmi's narrative, that they were more competitive in natural sciences because it was a need. They had to learn the natural sciences in order to fulfill the procedures of their job role. So it was more associated with the Khilafah system, where they had to learn these sciences to fulfill a job role rather than be committed to certain ideologies and internal conflicts that were going on within Islamic civilization. And now this takes me on to the second part of my lecture, which is the new science of Hay'a, which is known as the science of configurations, or which I call new astronomy because of its parallel to the old astronomy of the Greeks. That was created during the same time period. Now this science, by the way, was not created during Ma'mun al-Rashid's time. This science was created after Mutawakkil. And this science is created after Mu'tazilites' connection with the Khilafah is over. And now the traditionalists are back in force. And that's when this connection is being restated. And bear in mind, as I mentioned, that Mutawakkil, that time was more flourishing scientifically than Ma'mun's time. The classical narrative states that Ma'mun's time was more flourishing scientifically, but what we find when we look into the history, more translations, more sciences, more the creation of new disciplines of science occurred during Mutawakkil and the later periods. So now moving on to the creation of new discipline, which occurred in the 8th through 9th century, which is known as Hay'a, new astronomy. So I'll use this science as a template to illustrate Islam's interaction with the natural science as well as mathematical sciences, because it's a theoretical astronomy. So I use both observation as well as mathematics. And bear in mind that this science that I'm discussing has no equivalent in Greek tradition. So Muslims created this science. Greeks have astronomy, which was connected with astrology. And the way they did astronomy was totally different to the way Muslims did astronomy. And I will point out the differences in the next few slides. Now here is a schematic illustration showing how astronomy, which is the scientific study of celestial objects, materialized and fared in Islamic civilization. Now what I'll do is I'll talk you through this diagram, because this diagram is the backbone of my entire second part of the lecture. So the green, you got to the bottom left, you got a key to my diagram. You got green horizontal lines, you got red horizontal lines, you got blue dotted vertical line, and you have yellow arrows. Now the green horizontal line is representing precursor to the Islamic golden age of new astronomy. So that's what the green horizontal line points to. And that's when Muslims began correcting Greek parameters, astronomical parameters, with fresh observation. Now bear in mind, when is that occurring? That's occurring right at the start of Islamic civilization, around about 8th, 9th century. So those who think that Islam received Greco-Roman sciences blindly need to know that Muslims were critiquing the Greek science right from the start. If we go by the classical narrative that Hajjaj ibn Yusuf bin Matar, who translated 2 Greco-Roman works, one on mathematics known as Euclid's Elements, and the other which was Al-Majest, written by Claudius Ptolemy. That was the astronomical work. Now these 2 works he translated was in the year 827. This is during Ma'mun al-Rashid's reign. If we go by that narrative, which is being propagated as a classical narrative, Orientalist narrative, then we find that Muslims were already at that point correcting the Greek works. So if that's when they are in contact with the Greek sciences and they're already correcting it, that means Muslims never received the Greek sciences blindly and just took it on board without making any changes to it. Straight away it's coming into Islamic civilization and they are making corrections to it. That's where the precursor period, which is in green horizontal lines. And after the correcting Greek parameters, immediately after that started the critical tradition, which I mentioned was the shukuk literature, the shukuk genre. So works started to come out known as shukuk ala Batlamiyus, shukuk ala Jalinus. Batlamiyus, by the way, is Claudius Ptolemy. So they have these names which sound really ajib, interesting. Then you got Jalinus, which is Galen. Now Ptolemy and Galen are contemporaries. They both came from the second century Common Era, the Gregorian century. And these 2 people these 2 individuals, one was a medical physician and the other one was an astronomer, were being critiqued within the initial moments when Muslims received the Greco-Roman sciences into their tradition. Then one of the most bothersome issues that they encountered at that time was that, the Greek-Roman tradition, especially when Ptolemy wrote 2 of his major works. One was Al-Majest, and he wrote another work after that known as Planetary Hypothesis. Now, Al-Majest was mathematical constructs, And planetary hypothesis, I mean, this is an oversimplification, but more or less it was a mathematical construct with some solutions. But then you have the planetary hypothesis, which was physics, which was physical solutions to that mathematical constructs. Now, what he did, there was a discrepancy and disharmony between his two works. So Muslims found this problematic, and that disharmony could not remain, because for Muslims, mathematics had to agree with the physics. You cannot have a natural world, a physical world, that does not agree with your mathematics. And you cannot have mathematics that doesn't agree with the natural world. So there had to be a conceptual integration between the mathematics and physics. Well, in the Claudius Ptolemy's model, Ptolemy puts his hand up and he says, this is a divine occurrence, that there is, I cannot explain the natural world through the mathematics the models I've constructed, therefore I put my hands up, this is just a divine thing. But Muslims were the first civilization. Now we are being told today that we say that God did it, everything becomes a God did it contentment. But the reality is that Muslims were the first to say that before we are content with God did it, let us make investigations and find out for ourselves whether there is a natural explanation to this phenomena. So Muslims were the first to do that. They were the first because during their new astronomy, they critiqued Ptolemy and they connected the maths and physics together in such a way that the maths and physics was conceptually integrated, and they found solutions in the new age of golden age, the golden age of new astronomy, which I'm going to come to in a minute. So this was a very bothersome issue for Muslims, that why is the maths not agreeing with the physics? Why is there disharmony? Then comes the red horizontal lines, which you can see to the right side of my diagram. Now there are three phases. So you have and that's, by the way, the golden age. And at the top of the diagram you can see pre-Ghazzalian period and post-Ghazzalian period. And I intentionally included that because there are some academics, like the famous astrophysicist Professor Neil Tyson, who criticized Imam Ghazali for heralding into the Islamic civilization decline of natural sciences through his work known as Tahafutul Falasifa, the inconsistencies of philosophers. Now bear in mind, Imam Ghazali departed from this world 1111 Common Era. And after Imam Ghazali, we have a period here, as you can see in the red lines, the red horizontal lines, which is the new golden age of astronomy within Islamic civilization. So if Neil Tyson is accurate in his reading of history, then why is it that we've got a new golden age occurring in astronomy, which is the field that Neil Tyson is an expert in, which is occurring after Imam Ghazali? So why did this happen after a new golden age, when Imam Ghazali was meant to be an individual who brought the decline of natural science into Islamic civilization? So we know that we can see from this that that narrative doesn't seem to work when we trace the history from the 8th century up to the 16th century. Now remember another thing here, the golden age of Islamic civilization is starting from the 8th century, and it goes all the way up to the 16th century and not 12th century as the classical narrative has us believe. So the golden age didn't end at 12th century. And one of the reasons why they did that is because they found that in the years that, in the centuries from 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, Muslims wrote commentaries, shuruhat, commentaries. And they just made an assumption that these commentaries are just regurgitations of the works that were done before the great scientist, who was the pioneer of the scientific method, Ibn al-Haytham. So before him, there was books written like shukuk literature that I pointed out, and after it was shuruhat, and they thought these shuruhat are just regurgitation. There's nothing novel in this work. But reality is that when we look at those shuruhat and those commentaries, we find that in those shuruhat, Muslims were inventing new mathematical theorems, and there are two which Nicholas Copernicus, who carried out the scientific revolution in Europe, there are two theorems he used. One was by Nasiruddin at-Tusi, who is a Maragha astronomer from Iran, in the 13th century, and the other is from his own colleague and student, Mu'ayyiduddin al-Urdi. Now these are called Tusi couple, and you can check these up in your own time. There are the motion of his theorem is being represented, you can check this up on Wikipedia. Now Tusi and Urdi, they've invented new mathematical theorems which are being used in scientific revolution of the 16th century. We also had alternative constructions, and that's a whole tradition from 12th century up until 16th century. Muslims provided alternative astronomical models to the Ptolemaic astronomy. Also, the most significant part was that Muslims, they also provided theoretical objections which went right at the level of philosophy of science, and in a very nuanced manner they described whether mathematics is a language of science or whether mathematics holds intrinsic truth. And Muslims were the first to understand the nature and the philosophy of mathematics, that mathematics does not have truth, intrinsic truth. It's a language of science. So if the natural phenomena doesn't agree with the numbers that you have, abstract numbers in your head, then those numbers have to be dropped, but natural phenomena has to be retained. So this is the way Muslims, there was a scientist, his name was Shamsuddin al-Khafri, who wrote a work in 16th century, around about when Europe went through the scientific revolution. At that time he wrote a work and he described correctly the understanding of mathematics and science, and the mathematics and natural sciences and their connection. So that's the red lines. Then you have the blue dotted vertical line in the middle, which dissects the diagram in the middle into two. Now that blue dotted vertical line has orange arrows projecting towards the right, and that is the point where the conceptual scientific revolution began within the Islamic civilization. Now that's occurring around about 12th century. And that's the point where the scientific method is pioneered. That's the point when Imam Ghazali has already departed from this world. And that's the point where Muslims are writing commentaries upon the earlier works which have novel ideas and not regurgitations of the old works. They're critiquing the old work. I'll give you an example of that. Ibn al-Haytham, for example, when he criticized the Greek astronomical tradition, and one of the bothersome issues to Ibn Haytham was the disconnect between the mathematics and the physics of Ptolemy. When the 13th century came, Mu'ayyiduddin al-Urdi, he studies Ibn al-Haytham, and he says these are elaborate and beautiful criticisms, but the problem is Ibn al-Haytham provides no solution. So Mu'ayyiduddin al-Urdi then provides a solution through his mathematical theorem, which came to be known as Urdi lemma, which then Nicholas Copernicus used in his model in the 16th century, which was the scientific revolution of 16th century. So there are academics such as Otto Neugebauer, also Noel Swerdlow, and many others who have looked into Nicholas Copernicus and similarities between his works and the Muslim astronomers who were working in the Golden Age from the 12th century onwards. And there were a lot of similarities that they came from the 1957 onwards. They've seen at least 3 similarities, and similarities are with the work of Ibn Shatir, similarities are with the work of Nasiruddin al-Tusi, and also with Nicholas Copernicus has similarities in his works, the revolutionary bus, with the works of Mu'ayyiduddin al-Urdi. So these were all found in Nicholas Copernicus' works, which we find in the Islamic Golden Age, which I'm calling the conceptual scientific revolution. So you can demarcate into actual scientific revolution because Nicholas Copernicus moved the center of the universe away from the earth to the sun. But the conceptual scientific revolution is, the reason I'm calling it conceptual scientific revolution is because of its heliocentric bias. And the reason I say that is because authorities who are working in this field, like historians and mathematicians who studied Nicholas Copernicus' works, they found so many similarities between his work and the Islamic Muslim astronomers that they said all he had to do is just shift the sun away from, shift the earth away from the center and bring the sun into a center, and more or less other parts of the models were solved for him by the Muslim astronomers that lived before him. Now this may be a bit oversimplification, there are a lot of technicalities, so I make these claims very tentatively. But what can't be denied is the fact that Muslim tradition was taking place before Nicholas Copernicus at a time when Byzantium was in dark ages, because Byzantium Empire from the 6th century onwards up to around about 9th century was in dark ages, and in the 12th century that's when the Byzantium started to rise, a reawakening, which is known as the Renaissance. So if it was 12th century and that's when they are rising, then in the 16th century, that's when the two civilizations are at equal footing to each other. So Nicholas Copernicus doesn't have precursors in his own civilization that can be teaching him such sophisticated astronomy which was taking place within the Islamic civilization. And there was this very close contact going on, but the transmission, how it occurred, is unknown, and it's a matter of time before we get to know that. So next one down is the yellow arrows. Now yellow arrow, at the beginning you can see astrology removed. Now remember, modern science doesn't consider astrology as part of astronomy, and astrology is considered conjectural science, a pseudoscience. You can read the works of philosophers of science such as Paul Thagard, and he's got works on why astrology is a pseudoscience, and he explains that. And many of philosophers of science try to demarcate science, who explain astrology to be a pseudoscience. Now, which civilization was the first civilization to remove astrology from astronomy? It was the Muslim civilization. Muslims were discomforted with astrology being part of astronomy right from the beginning of their civilization in the 8th and 9th century. So that was removed. Also, we have towards the 16th century, the yellow arrow pointing upwards at 16th century. That's when the scientific revolution occurred. That's when geocentrism was converted into heliocentrism. Earth-centered universe cosmology was converted to sun-centered cosmology. Now, I will just go through, I've got only 2 minutes, yeah? So I'll just skip through everything I had here. So what I'll do is I'll just make one last quote, and I'll end the lecture on that, inshallah. So here we have Professor George Saliba, and he more or less elegantly summarizes my lecture in this one statement. And Professor is saying, Islamic astronomy that was not a mere regurgitation of the older Greek astronomy, nor was it a total break from it. So Muslims didn't have a vested interest in defending Aristotelian physics. But at the same time, they were bothered by Ptolemy providing a model which was supposed to agree with Aristotelian physics, but then it disagreed. It had a disharmony with that. So they didn't regurgitate that, but they were neither total break and neither were they in compliance with that. And yet it was in a position to lay the foundation for a revolutionary upset of that astronomical tradition. And this is the revolutionary upset which I am referring to as the conceptual scientific revolution that occurred between 12th century to 16th century Common Era. And I conclude with that statement, and I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. Thank you very much for listening. So this is the thing with what we have is the European narrative, which, because when Europe began studying Islamic history, the first encounter they had was with the jurisprudence and Islamic law. And in the jurisprudence and Islamic law, and that's the realm of traditionalists. So we have, within Islamic scholars, you have those who took on board the ancient sciences, and then you had those who studied the traditional sciences, and who had very minimal expertise in natural and philosophical sciences. So the tradition that took on board the traditional sciences, that tradition more or less had reached its pinnacle at around by Imam Ghazali's time or before that time. So it seems that when the Orientalists began studying the Islamic history, they involved themselves with the traditionalist narrative. And they found that at around by Imam Ghazali's time, traditional narrative reaches its pinnacle, and that's it. There is no more sophistication. Whereas they began studying the ancient sciences and the philosophical sciences in the 1920s, 1930s, around about that time. So when they found that the ancient sciences, when that aspect is studied, they found that actually, even though the traditionalist narrative had reached its most sophisticated stage at around by Imam Ghazali or time before, but the ancient sciences continued. So Muslims continued in their observations and sciences even after that. So it seems that Neil Tyson may have been mistaken from the earlier Orientalist readings from the Age of Reason to the 1920s, 1930s, when the Orientalists began studying the other type of scholarship, which was also so that's a husnul zan, you know, the more good thought that I have. But there could be more an agenda as well to show a conflict between Islam and science. And to be able to consolidate that type of narrative, you pin down your narrative to Mu'tazilites versus traditionalists. And to be able to do that, you got to target theologians such as Imam Ghazali, because Imam Ghazali was like, one of the triumphatic theologians who broke the Mu'tazilites narrative in the 10th and 11th century. So that's my two answers to that. One, which is based on husnul zan, and the other, which could be more agenda-led, and I leave that open to the people to decide.
Okay, Jazakallah khair to Sheikh Usman Ali for a very comprehensive and detailed talk. I just want to say, obviously, if there are questions that come up in your mind over the course of it, there is an opportunity to ask those questions later on. And Ustad, you did mention also that we've got the venue till later on, 10:30, so there will be an opportunity for you to meet with the speakers. Okay, so on to the next speaker is Dr Shoaib Ahmed Malik, who has a Bachelor of Engineering in Chemical Engineering. He's currently actually undertaking an MSc in Philosophy of Science and Religion at the University of Edinburgh, and that's ongoing, right? And his PhD is in Chemical Engineering, which he undertook at the University of Nottingham in 2015. So he's currently working as an Assistant Professor of Sciences at Zayed University. Since then, Ustad, has there been any progression for Cycle Club? No. You can't have them all, but inshallah next time. All right, over to you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So like last time, I just got a couple of inches taller, and this is a mu'jiza, so we have to start believing in God now. So my presentation is, of course, one of the more controversial talks that you can have in the Muslim world. Muslims seem to be very heavily divided on this question, and you get lots of polarizing opinions and sometimes a lot of friction between people. I mean, I was at a meeting from 9 to 5 today, and we even had a discussion with a bunch of intellectuals, and we were on some sort of different ends, right? Sorry, can you all hear me? Yeah? Right, okay. So what I wanted to do for the sake of this presentation was to give Muslims some nuanced discussions on the academic side that happen without the necessary emotional attachments to it, without necessarily any political agenda. It is just an academic discussion to help open up some avenues where Muslims can think a little bit further, a bit more critically. So this is the overview of my conversation today. I'm first going to be highlighting what this talk is not about, because of course the whole realm of Islam and evolution is a pretty wide narrative. It has a lot of ends, a lot of different scopes to it. So I'm going to be first just pretty much outlining what I'm not going to be discussing. In the second part, I am going to be outlining what is my specific objective in this particular conversation. This is going to follow then with the general principles of evolution. I'm not going to go into any details per se. I'm just going to take the general overall principles, some of the implications of it that are causing some probable theological worries. Then I'm going to introduce what is known as the Ashri school of thought. Don't worry, I'm going to explain who these groups are, what this group is. And then we're going to take those principles of the Ashri school and then see whether we can tackle some of the problems that cause theological worry. Of the three that I'm specifically going to be focusing on are: 1, the problem of evil; 2, the problem of inefficiency, and 3, the problem of chance. Okay, so as far as I can see, right, if you wanted to look at the conversation of evolution and Islam, there are 3 specific domains that you have to look at. One is the science itself. Does the science explain, what is the best scientific data, the theory that we have that explains the data? Is evolution the theory or not? Right? And we can have a conversation there about which theory is the best, is evolution a worthy narrative or not, etc. I am not going to be discussing that today. The second aspect is the hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study of scripture. So you have the Quran, you have the Hadith, you have your basic principles in analyzing those two. And can we reach any sort of interpretations where evolution is compatible with Quran and Hadith? And if not, then should we reject it, or what should we do at that moment, right? Again, I am not discussing this. So anyone who's expecting a conversation about Adam alayhi salam and the hadith about him being 30 cubits tall, etc., I am not entertaining that. Today's conversation is purely a metaphysical or a theological or more particularly a doctrinal conversation. Is there anything in the general principles of evolution, if given true, if assumed true, does it have any problem with the Ash'ari school of thought? This is simply what I'm going to be discussing about today. So please bear in mind, now this is what I am going to be talking about. Within Islamic orthodoxy, so remember, I am speaking from an orthodox perspective. You pick up any book in Islamic theology, there are 3 main schools of thought that are within the scope of Islamic orthodoxy. You've got the Ash'ari school of thought, you've got the Maturidi, Ash'ari, okay, no worries, okay. So Ash'ari, you have the Maturidi, and then you have the Athari school of thought, right? These are the main 3 things. So the conversation that I'm going to be having today is specifically on one school. The reason why I point that out is because you can find opinions based on other schools, valid opinions based on other schools of thought. These are just like, you have differences in fiqh where you have people who pray sometimes up here, sometimes with their hands down here. These are based on different schools of fiqh. We have different schools in aqidah. All are valid. We all consider them valid. Of course, some people have friction between them because of social politics. That's a whole other discussion. So you can have principles based on slightly different schools of thought. No problem. I'm going to be focusing on the Ash'ari worldview. Now, within the Ash'ari worldview, you will have many representatives who we have highlighted as the key thinkers in this school. Imam Baqalani, Juwayni, Ghazali, Imam Razi, right? So I'm going to be focusing on Imam Ghazali. Personally, I find him as one of the most iconic thinkers of Islamic history. His works have personally helped me a lot as an academic and as a Muslim. And that's why I want to focus on him and specialize on him for this conversation. In addition to having inter-school differences, you're also going to be having intra-school differences within the school. And finally, and this is just more of an academic point, there have been slightly different interpretations over whether Imam Ghazali was an Ash'ari or not. This is happening in the academic realm, right? So if you go to university and if you study Islamic theology, you will see some professors, they don't think that he was an actual Ash'ari. So some people think of him as a pseudo-philosopher or Neoplatonist. We don't need to worry about that. I personally disagree with that interpretation myself. I'm going to be focusing as if he is an Ash'ari, yeah? Right, but that's just there just for the sake of presenting a presentation that has integrity to make sure you know that there are some nuances even here. So that's why I specifically highlight, this is not the Ghazalian interpretation, this is a Ghazalian interpretation. Right, now, what are the principles of evolution? Like I said, I'm not going to put up any fancy diagrams. I'm not going to try and convince you. I'm just taking, these are the general principles. So we have a few lines of evidence for evolution. If you want more depth, if you want a tafsir of this, we have a microbiologist who can answer all your questions right here. And she's a PhD, she's a full expert on this. Now, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. So we have a couple of different evidences that help us understand how humans came to be and how they arrived in the form that they are today. So we have something called the fossil record, right? So this is basically the general idea that as we go down, layer by layer, we see all different types of simpler species. And the idea here is that the fossil record is some sort of like a time continuum where we can see a historical record of animals, plants, and species and stuff like that that seem to be developing over time gradually. Right? We also have elements of different lines of evidence. One of them is molecular clocks. One of them is anatomical comparisons. So we seem to have some sort of statistical similarities between some sort of formal structures, designs, etc. And then the most strongest evidence, at least for me, is genetics. The genetic information that we have about how animals are related, species are related with one another, I think is by far one of the strongest and most overwhelming evidences. I am taking these as a given. I'm not going to be going into this at the moment. This is just taken as a given for the sake of this presentation. The general principles in terms of how evolution works, you basically have this idea that you have a species, it obviously has offspring. Within that offspring, there is some level of similarity with the parent generation, but there's also some differences, right? And those differences can be caused by a variety of things. You have mutation errors that then themselves are caused by, various factors. You have X-rays, there's a copying error of the genetics, and all sorts. And also, you have to bear in mind that evolution works on the premise that there's also a competition of resources. So if you have a locality, species are obviously going to compete with the limited amount of resources. Obviously, when species do survive, they're surviving on the species that is the best adapted for that specific locality. And then that's how the whole sort of natural selection process works out. So I am taking all of this as a given for this conversation. Now I'm going to come to the Ash'ari school of thought. Now before I begin this, I actually, because this is now basically a rigorous form of theology, when I wanted to do this presentation, I actually asked my sheikh, should I even make this a public discourse? Because theology, is a very sensitive topic. Two, you have to make sure that the person you're speaking to has the capacity to understand some of these things. Learning theology it requires a lot of time and due diligence and patience. So I asked my sheikh, this is a conversation that happens in madrasas, happens in academic institutions. Should we make this into a public conversation? Because if you read many books on theology, if you read many books on how to treat the relationship between the teacher and the student, one of the advices that's been given to teachers is to make sure that the person you're addressing to has the capability to be able to understand this. Now, of course, the settings of the ulama at the time, in the 14th century, 12th century, etc., they had a specific configuration. We are now living in an information-centric society. You want to refute Islam, it's at the palm of your hands. You want to find any aspect of Islam, be it negative or positive, on any topic possible, it's at the palm of your hand. So I think rather than now questioning that, I think we should make this a bit more public and allow people to be able to make their own conclusions. So I just wanted to point that disclaimer in the very beginning. So the Ash'ari school of thought, they have 5 general principles that I want to focus on. This is not an exhaustive list of who they are. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just 5 specific principles that I need for my conversation to work. 1, they believe that physical causality is absolutely contingent. By that I mean, if I have a water bottle and if I drop it, we know according to scientific data that it will drop. Right? That is based on the laws of Newton. Most of us study this at high school. And if I keep dropping it, if I drop it here, if anywhere else, if somebody else drops it, it'll always go down according to the laws of Newton. Now, the being that is sustaining those laws is God, right? And it is completely possible that Allah at one point could easily, keep that afloat, make it go up left and right. In the Ash'ari school of thought, there is no such thing as that physical regularity is necessary. It is something that God does habitually, according to His will. And that's the reason why we can do science in the first place. So we're not denying science. This is a very, sort of a slippery slope. No one is denying science in the Ash'ari school of thought. We don't deny it. All we're saying that link between cause and effect is not necessary. It is a contingent link. And that was the mistake that Ghazzali criticized about Avicenna, for example, in his Tahafut al-Falasifa, which is an iconic book in Islamic history. The second point is that creation in of itself has no autonomy. By that I mean that if God is absolutely powerful, if He is an absolutely maximal being that controls absolutely everything and nothing is outside the fold and the power of God, then that means everything in creation is directly derived from Him. Okay? Now, of course, there's a lot of different technicalities that we can go into, but I'm just going to state is that everything is in the control of God. There were some groups and some individuals who believed that, for example, there were some things that fell outside the power of God. But if you believe that, then you're no longer considering God as fully omnipotent, as fully all-powerful. So one of the general principles in the Ash'ari school of thought is that everything, even you, human autonomy, is in the will, is in the power of God. Number 3, God has knowledge of absolutely everything. That means He has knowledge of your past states, of your present states, of your future states. There's nothing that escapes the power of God. Nothing. He knows when every atom is going to go left, when it's going to go right, when it's going to go in existence, out of existence, absolutely everything. We don't believe that in some, for example, some thinkers like Avicenna, they believe that God does not know particulars. What that means is that He doesn't know your particular decisions to try and salvage some sort of free will mechanism. God knows absolutely everything. So this should be a little bit crystal clear. Of course, this somebody might ask me the question, how does this tie in with our free will? If God knows everything, right? If God knows everything, and if God is in absolute power of everything, then where does that leave our free will? Because we are human beings, we have existential agency, we are able to make decisions, we are able to will, to choose. I chose to come here. I could have chosen to just stay home and eat chips and watch Netflix, right? I know there's some series that are on right now. So I could have done that, but I didn't, right? So we have this idea of existential agency. And this is one of the most pressing questions in theology and philosophy. How do you salvage those two very contradictory problems? On the one hand, so there are 4 logical solutions, 4 logical possible solutions. 1, you believe that God has absolute power and absolute knowledge, and therefore free will is an illusion. So you are just an illusion. You don't actually have free will. This is one logical possibility. Another logical possibility is that God actually has limited power. So that means to say that human autonomy is powerful, that it does exist, it comes outside the power of God. That is one possibility. But in order to do that, you have to sacrifice God's power, that He does not control everything. He only controls everything except the human being. That is one option. Another option is that you keep God's power as absolute, but then you keep His knowledge limited, such that He will not know what you do, what decisions you make. That is your third possibility. The fourth possibility, again, logical possibility, is that both God's power and God's knowledge are limited, and therefore free will is not a problem in that case. Now the thing is, all 4 are problematic. All 4 are problematic. The first one is problematic because then it completely eliminates the idea of free will. And that means that the Sharia that Allah sent down to us, the whole idea of judgment and revelation, becomes useless. It becomes a problem. If you choose the latter 3, the fact that you have chosen the option of limiting God is something that's an alien concept. There is no shape or form that God is limited in any sense or form. So this is why these 4 solutions are all problematic by their logical nature. And I think this is where Ghazali had a very interesting solution. See, Ghazali has a lot of misconceptions surrounding him. That he rejected reason and he became a Sufi and all that stuff, etc. This is all false in my opinion. I don't think that he ever rejected reason. He actually embraced reason until the very end of his life. But he developed an amazing spiritual transformation which allowed him to write a magnum opus called Ihya Ulumuddin, Revival of the Religious Sciences. And if you read that specific work and some other works, the way he interpreted this was that he came up with an a-rational solution, not irrational. Irrational means is that it doesn't make sense. And what you're talking about is garbage, right? It's beyond logic. Or no, it is against logic, not beyond logic. Irrational means he believed in this idea that there are some realities that are outside the scope of reason. Yeah? I mean, we as Muslims, we believe we have a spiritual nature in us. It doesn't conform necessarily to the material world or to the logical world. And because of that, he reached a sort of a spiritual dimension in which he believed that this solution is beyond our rational limits. So this is called a mystical theodicy, a spiritual solution, because it is outside the domain of logical application or the logical reach at least. So in his 35th book, I think, in his book of Tawakkul, in his Ihya Ulumuddin, this is why he says, trust in God, believe, you have agency. But how this works out, Allahu A'lam, we don't know. right? It doesn't. We can't figure it out, at least from a rational level. So that's how he sort of salvages that option. There are, of course, other thinkers within the Islamic tradition who have other solutions to the problem of free will and autonomy, but we don't need to get into that. I'm specifically focusing on the Ash'ari and then particularly on the Ghazzalian solution. Finally, the Ash'aris are also theological voluntarists. What this means is that this is related to the idea of what is good and bad. Okay? Now, Allah, we believe, the Ash'aris believe at least, that everything that Allah dictates as good and bad was His choice, right? So if we believe that, for example, that helping one another is a good thing, that value was made good by the choice of God. But Allah could have easily created another possible world where He could have flipped the good and the bad, right? So He could have made, for example, another possible world where killing might have been a good thing, for example, or torturing each other was a good thing. This is completely under the power of God. It is completely under the power of God. This is a tenet that is strongly held in the Ash'ari school of thought. And now, and God Himself, some people said that in the early phase, at least in Islamic theology, there were some individuals who believed that God cannot do something that is unjust or something that is evil. So they prescribed of what He can and cannot do based on our moral intuitions, which in themselves are creations of God in us. And Ash'aris had a problem with that, right? So this is the reason why Ash'aris never conform to that we have to safeguard God's power, that God can do anything. He can assign anything to be good. He can assign anything to be bad. These are general textbook Ash'ari tenets in the school. There's nothing contradictory or controversial here. Now, let's try, keeping that baggage in mind, keeping those claims in mind, let's try and see if we can go through the problems of evolution one by one by one. So the first is the problem of evil. Okay? This is now a massive issue in literature, and of course, it creates a lot of problems even amongst people's lives. So the problem of evil, how do you address it? Because the reason why it's a problem, particularly in evolution, or it's amplified in evolution, is because if we believe the narrative that God created all these simple species, and then many species died in that process. I mean, I've seen some estimates, broad estimates, 99% of all the species that lived are now extinct, and they all died in the process and leading up to us. So that seems like a very cruel and harsh and evil process, and there's all sorts of suffering around the world. So how do you deal with all that, right? Well, God is the creator of everything. He creates absolutely everything. And we know that Allah is the direct creator of evil and good. We don't have a problem with that. We accept that. Face blank value. We don't need to say that God is not the source of evil. If everything is created by Him, He is also the creator of good and evil. That's not a problem for us. Because morality is contingent, by that I mean it's not necessary, we don't have to conform that, we don't have to make that Allah is also objectively a good entity. For example, this is a useful analogy. If you consider a programmer, so I'm guessing we all play games, Counter-Strike, what's the new one, Fortnite? Anyone know Fortnite? No? Yes? Parents might know this. Yeah, oh yeah, kids are nodding. Okay. So imagine you have a programmer, right? And he's made two of the exact same games. In one game, right, if you kill someone, you get points. If you kill someone, you lose points. The mechanics of the games are exactly the same. The moral judgments are different. God is exactly like that. He could have made something good or bad in this life. He could have changed it. He could have done anything else. So to ascribe that God is evil from the standard that He has set within this universe, within this creation, is a bit of a problem, because we don't believe that God is evil in any shape or sense of the form. This is the value that He has ascribed for us in this particular life. So keeping that in mind, the problem of evil is not really a problem at all. It is not a problem in the Ash'ari school of thought. This is a well-known issue. The second is the problem of inefficiency. Many people, or at least in the current literature, there is some sort of contention about that God, He had such a long and extortionate process, so many resources were spent, that why didn't God just make human beings ala tul and khalas, this problem would be solved. So this is you have to understand the nature of God to be able to see this objection. One, inefficiency means that you have limited resources. You have either limited space, time, or material. For example, if I have a room, let's say 2 meter by 2 meter, imagine somebody who keeps one bed in that room in comparison to 3 beds, he creates a bunk bed, etc. The person who creates 3 beds in that same size room is using the room much more efficiently than the first one. Efficiency in terms of time. If you have, for example, two factories and they're both producing, for example, a product of tables. One company produces 40 tables a week, another company produces 100 tables a week. The one that produces 100 is much more efficient. Likewise with material. If I have given you, a block of wood and one carpenter uses 90%, the other one uses 40%, the one that's 90% is much more efficient. God doesn't have restrictions like those because God is not a material nor is he a temporal being. So when we say that God is being efficient, it's actually a false ascription to him. He doesn't have limitations. Therefore, no matter how he designed the process of coming into our being, it makes no difference. The inefficiency is a false qualification of God and onto God. So this is not a problem. Finally, this issue of chance, this idea of God playing dice, etc., is a big theme that happens in evolution. So the way I want to tackle this is by first explaining the idea of how chance is linked with things like knowledge. Imagine if you have a coin, right? So we toss coins all the time. Now we know logically a coin has two sides, right? It has heads or tails, and it can only fall either on heads or tails. Of course, remove the exceptions for a second. If it lands miraculously on its side, the thin side, forget that for a second. You have only two logical possibilities. Now, at a specific toss, we don't know whether that's going to fall on heads or whether that's going to go on tails. We don't know that because there's so many factors involved. How much you hit, all the force balances that happen on the coin, the exact, the way the air waves work on the surface of the coin, all the atoms that brush against the air, all of those nitty-gritty details we don't know. So when we, toss a coin and we get, like, for example, 3 heads in a row, we casually say, oh, this happened by chance, right? We assign this, even in our language, we assign it to chance. Now, similarly, when we talk about evolution, for example, when biologists sometimes talk about, oh, that mutation happened by chance, right? Now, what does that exactly mean when biologists are talking about that? Does that mean that we don't know about it, that there's no cause behind it? So this is the sort of realm that I want to sort of discuss. There are 4 kinds of interpretations of chance that I think will make the discussion a bit more clear. There's first the kind of chance where we don't know the explanation of the entity. For example, if I knew all the force balances, every single atom in that coin toss, I would for sure be able to predict where and when it will land. This is completely obvious, right? But if I don't have all the information about that specific system, then I cannot say for certainty it's an unknown cause, at least for time being. Then there's a second type of cause called unknowable cause. We just cannot know. We are not in the position to know. For example, we know that human beings cannot travel back in time. Maybe we can, I don't know. Maybe quantum mechanics will be able to do that. Wallahu alam. Okay, I just opened up a can of worms. Please cut this out. So imagine that if somebody asked you, can you figure out what Julius Caesar wore the second day before he died at 1 o'clock? The thing is, if we have no historical records, we have no way of knowing of how to be able to understand that. It's an unknowable. We are not in the position or capacity to know what that information is. So we have sometimes things occur in nature. We just don't know the cause. We're not in the position to know the cause, right? So this has to do with what we can know. These two are not problematic from our point of view, from the Ash'ari point of view. Now, the third refers to having no physical cause. For example, in the Ash'ari metaphysics, right, we believe, like I said, that physical law is contingent. If I drop this bottle, physical law says that it must fall down, right? Also, we know from science that things have a material precedent, right? So, for example, if I wanted to, let's say, if I burn this book, for example, it's going to turn into ash. But Allah can do things where there is no preceding cause, physical cause. For example, He could, from one moment to another, create a monkey in front of me. He could, for example, create a unicorn in front of me. He could, for example, create this into fire. Like, He doesn't need physical precedents to do things or manifest things. This is completely in the power of God. But like I said, again, because people will think, astaghfirullah, Ash'ari, you're anti-science, astaghfirullah. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. All I'm saying is that it is in the power of God. But Allah Himself says, even in the Quran, that He has instilled, He has chosen to put order in this universe so that you can understand that there's order and intellectual capacity put behind these roles and in nature, basically. So even though, now if this is possible, then this is not a problem, at least even in the Ashari school of thought, that Allah can do things without a preceding material cause. This is in the power of God. And this does not mean that God plays dice, because if God chose to manifest something without a preceding material cause, this is not a problem. The only type of problem in terms of chance-like explanations is the fourth one. This is where the real issue lies. This is where, for example, we say things that Allah, some philosophers of science, they say that God plays on a dice-like basis. So when mutations happen, He keeps, since He Himself doesn't know what's happening, He's evolving with nature. Right? So since God doesn't know, they keep God's knowledge limited, they keep God's power limited, and they give some sort of autonomy to nature. And they allow nature to evolve on its own as if it's some sort of autonomous agent outside of God. And what happens with that is that since God does not know what's going to happen in all future states, they make God more like an anthropomorphic or a human-like being, in that He doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. This particular type of cause, in which God doesn't know the future and He's evolving with nature, that is something that will be unacceptable, at least from the Ashari perspective. That is where theologically, as far as we can go, we won't be able to accept that. So, just to wrap things up, because I know I particularly just want to focus on the Q&A. My only point in presenting this narrative was to show that, look, there is forms of logical, compatibility. We shouldn't be so souped up by hyper-emotional narratives, or, like being able to fall under school doesn't mean we can't think outside the box. I really love Imam Ghazzali. I understood his works, I tried to follow his works, and I just tried to take the general principles to see how we can address a modern and contemporary problem. And according to that, I think that at least from a metaphysical or a theological perspective, aqidah perspective, evolution, with all its implications and all its probable principles, does not conflict with evolution. And as long as those following principles are maintained, that no autonomy exists outside of God, God knows absolutely everything, and God doesn't play dice in the strong sense, in that He Himself doesn't know what He's creating. That we cannot accept. Barakallahu feek. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you. So Dr. Ahmed here is asking, can you please explain how the Ashari worldview will work with the quantum mechanics? Now look, first of all, quantum mechanics is still under many interpretations. You've got Copenhagen interpretation, which is this idea that atoms pop into existence on a probabilistic level, right? So electrons come in and out of existence at a probabilistic level. This is not a problem in Ashari, because we can accept something without a preceding material cause. If you believe in the Bohmian equation, where there are some hidden factors in there, we just don't know what they are, so the problem is epistemic, again, no problem. So from an Ashari point of view, that's actually fine. One of the, what's his name? Massimo Campanini. He wrote a book recently on Ghazali by Routledge publication in 2018, just recently. And in that he says that all of these, counterintuitive ideas where we think of things like fuzzy logic, quantum mechanics, in the Ashari worldview, in Ghazali's worldview, it would not have shocked him. Because this is completely acceptable in the metaphysics that we have. The theological world we have is actually much more accommodating to science than other worldviews such as Aristotelianism or Essentialism. Barakallahu feek.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. Jazakallah for your speech. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned a point at the end, I probably misunderstood, that you said the Ash'ari creed does not conflict the evolution theory.
Yeah. From a metaphysical, from a principle point of view.
From principle.
Yeah, no, I haven't entertained any discussion on hermeneutics, and I'm not going to entertain that today.
And if I'm correct, I understand you attributed this assertion towards Imam Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe that if you take his general principles, I don't think he would have a problem with this, with these principles of evolution.
Right, okay. So, in that context, can you just define evolution? What do you mean evolution in this context?
Evolution in this context, I mean, just as a broad denomination, in the sense that species changing over time, like species evolving over time from one another. That's what I mean by that, evolution.
I mean, just evolving. If you could kindly elaborate, what kind of evolvement are you talking about in terms of height, in terms of color? What kind of evolvement are you referring to?
All sorts. Because if you drive with the genetic aspects, right? So it's all at the genetic level, and then you have the phenotypic expressions. So all I mean is that over time, if you have some starting genetic material, over time you get these development and expressions of various species, and humans are just one end of a channel of that. That's what I mean by that.
Okay, thank you.
Barakallah feek.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you foresee a time in your lifetime when the Muslim community is more comfortable with evolutionary theories within our theology? And what do you think needs to happen for that to take place?
Okay, wow. Okay, so she's asked, do you foresee acceptance or integration of evolutionary theories in Islamic theology? And if not, what would need to happen to make that happen? So, look, my research is on science, religion, and philosophy. It's in the intersection of these three. And it's a very difficult field to work around because you simultaneously need to be an expert in three things, right? You can have theologians who when they approach science, they may have no clue what they're talking about, and vice versa. I mean, this is an area of expertise now we're talking about. What I'm saying is simply that, look, I've studied evolution, right? I'm not a biologist, and I'm the first to concede that I'm not a biologist. I've studied it. I come from a scientific background, so I can understand that language quite well. I've studied theology, and I'm finishing off my degree in philosophy. So based on that limited understanding, at least for now in my presentation, I believe that there's no conflict. Now, there may be other schools of thought who may see a conflict, right? There may be other interpretations within that scope, that orthodox scope, that may see an issue. So now the thing is, even though we are a united Muslim group, being united doesn't mean uniformity. We don't have to be uniformed in our mindset. We have a plethora of opinions and a plethora of scope to be able to have exchanges. So if you're asking me whether I think Muslims should finally embrace evolution, I don't think that's not my objective. All I'm trying to say is that, look at this. This is what evolution says. These are some of the theological principles. Does it connect or not? Now, one of the future conferences that we're holding, and I think this is going to be of interest to a lot of people, is in July, inshallah. We're still working out the exact details, but this is a conference where we are going to, for the first time, I don't think anyone has ever done this before, we're going to have 3 scholars, right? The first scholar is going to be a scientist who is going to just objectively present the evidences for evolution, against evolution, and the various interpretations of evolution from a scientific level. The second speaker is going to be an exegesis expert, somebody who's specialized in Quranic studies. And he is going to basically interpret all the Quranic ayat that seem to be in conflict, whether we can interpret this in another way or not, etc. So you have all the nuances there. And then we'll have a third person who's sitting right in front of him, but he doesn't know yet, somebody who's going to interpret the hadith, right? Somebody's going to interpret the hadith, at least all the problematic hadith from an evolutionary point of view, and see how they can be interpreted or whether we have to reject it. The point of that conference is that we want people to make their decisions based on the nuances. I have told all the speakers, you're not allowed to mention your opinion. You just mention the nuances, let people decide for themselves. So that is something that I think we should do, educate. Now, whether that's going to be embraced or not, it will depend on several factors. How open people are to these discussions, the social politics involved between madrasas and Darul Ulooms, I don't know. It's a very tough battle. It's a very tough battleground. Not just here, even in philosophy, you have heavy raging debates between people, right? What I'm saying is that we are just providing an outlet. Wallahu alam what happens next. Concluding my presentation in that there is no logical problem between evolution and the Ghazzalian principles of his Ashari worldview. That's it. So as long as you maintain the theological commitments that there is nothing that exists outside the power of God, number 1. God knows absolutely everything, number 2. And God doesn't play dice in the strong sense, in that He does something but He doesn't know the future, or He is just evolving with nature. That's it. Yeah. Yes.
Amazing talk. Thank you very much. My question is, you mentioned inefficiency as a problem with evolution. And I just want to caution...
Inefficiency is a problem when it comes to making God inefficient.
Yeah. I just want to caution that inefficiency is a narrow view of looking at evolution. Right? Because we don't know and we think it's inefficient, which probably it isn't. Probably it's very efficient and we are lacking in our knowledge and understanding.
Of course, I completely agree with that. I'm just saying that these are based on literature that I've read on people of, experts in philosophy of biology. This seems to be a problem, and that's the only reason why I made it apparent in this conversation.
I just want to your advice, please, about how to convince teenagers that Adam alayhi salam wasn't a monkey, or developed. Okay. What would be your answer? Thank you.
Okay, so Adam alayhi salam wasn't a monkey, right? Okay, so right, this is a tough question, a very controversial question. So she's asked about, you want to prove to your son that Adam alayhi salam wasn't a monkey. Okay. So, number one, I don't think evolution claims that, okay? No one claims that Adam alayhi salam was a monkey. So I think that's a false, ascription to the theory of evolution. With regards to now whether that specific point conflicts with Islam or not, please come to our lecture in July. Okay? Okay.
Nicely done.
Yeah.
Whew.
Is there a possibility, or is there an argument, or maybe in the future, for the science community to accept or come to some sort of reconciliation between the intelligent design theory and evolution?
Okay, so I'm going to actually give you the best answer, and you can just say yes or no. Doctor, she's a molecular biologist, okay? She's published in the highest level journals in biology. So what do you think, Dr. Anna? Yes or no?
I don't think there's any problem.
There you go. So let me just for the sake of the microphone. So the brother has asked a very good question: that can the scientific community eventually somehow potentially converge between evolution and intelligent design? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. And Dr. Rana, who is an expert in this field, she said there might, perfectly possible. No problem.
Jazakallah. And Sheikh Usman, a few words, if you would please, on this.
Yep. Oh, everyone can now see how taller I am than Sheikh Usman. Oh, mera beta.
I totally agree with Dr. Rana Dajani's opinion on this. I think there is it's more ideology that underlines both worldviews, and the position I've taken on this is that both intelligent design as well as the neo-Darwinism fall either within science or outside science. If you define neo-Darwinism within science, then intelligent design by the same token will fall within science. If you define neo-Darwinism outside science, then intelligent design theory also falls outside science. So that's the position I take on that. Yeah?
Just really to follow on from what Sheikh Usman said, I mean, you feel that there's an element of either belief or suspension of disbelief in certain things. Like, for example, the classical example of the monkeys typing on typewriters, which, you know, if they type long enough, they'll knock out the works of Shakespeare, which to me has always suggested that they're not very good mathematicians. So one of the things that I would welcome is the acceptance of the reliance on axioms, or the reliance on, you could almost call it beliefs, because I think that would be one way of leveling the playing field, because the creationists are always accused of basing their ideas on belief, but axioms and postulates of science are also a type of belief. Thank you.
Okay, so he's asked about, so he's first made the point, the brother's made the point that science relies on basic axioms, and then sometimes the scientific community holds onto them too rigidly and doesn't accept that there might be a reformulation of those axioms. Can the scientific community, can they accept that? So speaking as a scientist, and there are a few here as well, I think no genuine, honest scientist would hold on to axioms that strongly, because we always believe in revision. But of course, we believe that there are sometimes facts that are established. I mean, they're not questionable. For example, do you believe that babies come from a mother? Of course, right? Now, whatever interpretation we come up with that's always going to hold true. Does that make sense? Scientifically, at least. Now, unless if Allah can, if He wants to, He can do something else apart from that. But that is a fact, regardless of what sort of interpretations you have. In terms of paradigm evolution, that happens all the time. And scientists accept that. There might be some rigid scientists who occupy not a scientific worldview, they occupy something called scientism, when they believe that science is the only worldview that you can accept, regardless of the reformulation, etc. That is something that I think is a level of arrogance in one's worldview. Of course, reformulations is a part of the corrective structure of science. Yeah, for sure.
Question that's come on Facebook.
Okay.
From Zara Alexander.
Okay.
So, saying Jazakallah, very interesting. Wouldn't the Ash'ari Ghazali first epistemologically determine if evolution was based on definite evidence before he would attempt a theological reconciliation? Else, this would be a simple theological musing without any practicality.
Of course, that's absolutely true. So I've assumed for my presentation that just given evolution is true. Let's say it is, right? Whether it's true or not, we can of course get into the science of that, no doubt about it. I'm just saying, given it's true, would it conflict with any of the general tenets of the Ash'ari school of thought? And my conclusion is in the negative, it doesn't. Now, of course, the scientific aspect, inshallah, we're going to be covering in a future discussion. But yeah, that would be I assume that would be one of the ways that he would first approach the discussion, to first see whether the theory itself, within the data itself, holds. I would agree with that, yes.
Also, could the Mu'tazila and Athari Kalam be reconciled with evolution?
I've mostly studied the Ash'ari school of thought, and more particularly within that, the Ghazzalian school. So I'm not going to comment on the other schools. I would let other representatives who are much more knowledgeable than me to answer that question. But that's not going to be me, I'm afraid.
I just wanted you to give some advice on people who are maybe a lot of younger people as well, because they have a curiosity on this matter now in terms of when they're going to school and such, where people are making them curious as to how to understand this matter and explain it. So there are a lot of younger people that are pursuing, trying to find this out.
Yeah.
So obviously yourself, you've first, from the sounds of it, studied the sciences, and then now, for I'm not sure how many years, but I've been going into Islam and learning the theology of, for example, Ghazali with the Sheikh. And as you said yourself, you had to discuss with your Sheikh before deciding to actually hold this lecture.
Yeah.
Because it can potentially be a can of worms, because a lot of people, if they don't understand it right, they can end up in a very compromising position, especially young people with their iman, which is actually happening quite often now globally, with people going to sciences. I study science, and I studied biomedical science, and I have people that I studied with that were moving. People have I'd say some people did move into sort of becoming agnostic when they went into looking at this matter and researching it themselves. So what sort of advice would you give for a person, that people, which definitely in this day and age are trying to find some sort of reconciliation between intelligent design and the evolution theory, what sort of approach should they take in terms of getting an Islamic grounding alongside understanding the science? Should that be something they pursue first?
Design?
Not so much the idea of it in terms of consolidating deen with evolution, but in terms of prior to pursuing that, what grounding knowledge should they have? In terms of learning potentially the theology first, do you think it would help in learning the Islamic theology first?
Okay. All right. Okay, so the brothers asked a question about what sort of prerequisites we would need to be able to entertain a conversation like this. Did I capture your question? Okay. So I'll first answer that, then I'll explain what intelligent design is. Would that be okay? Right. So I think for me, theology, now the word aqidah, okay, has become a very dirty word. When I was growing up, okay, Aqeedah was thrown around left, right, and center for sectarian division. That's what that word was in my head in the beginning. It was only when I stopped, tried to flush all these negativities out, when I started learning, particularly with shuyukh and on the ground and trying to get some knowledge about this, I realized it's one of the most important things you can learn, because it creates a metaphysics that is, at least for me, it's one of the strongest metaphysical pictures that you can create. A theological worldview that is amazingly substantial to help anchor how you can view science, at least, or the metaphysical principles of science. So I would say, if I were to advise young people particularly, is to get particularly acquainted with shuyukh, with people of knowledge, not just the left, Mo, Joe, whatever on the road, right? Just people with very good knowledge about these topics and who are willing and open to opening these conversations. If you have a scholar who's quite rigid and just doesn't care about this, I think that scholar is outdated. I know that's a controversial statement to make, but a scholar who does not want to entertain these topics within his madrasa or his school is an outdated scholar. These conversations are taking place. We are living in an information-centric society. You can get any kind of doubts posed to you on your mobile phone. So I think having grounded knowledge in theology is a must, for sure. But I definitely think that just because you are equipped in that does not immediately make you qualified to access the scientific language. Science has its own pedagogical infrastructure. You need to be well acquainted with the math. You need to be very good in terms of the jargon. Just like you have jargon, specific aqeedah, kalamic jargon in theology books, you have specific jargon in science. So you need to be well acquainted with that. And trust me, you can get lost because there's so much that you could cover and still not be considered an expert. I mean, Dr. Rana, wouldn't you agree with that? There's so much hyper-specialization that you may not even cover everything in what you're covering. So I would say humility is one thing, but making sure you ground yourself both in the scientific axioms and not speaking out of ignorance, and even the theological axioms, and then trying to see what you can make out of it. That's the best you can do. That's the absolute best. Remember, the Quran and Hadith come from God. The world comes from God. If there's a conflict, it is in our construction of how we understand those two things. Right? Yeah. Yes, sorry, before you answer, I just need to point out what intelligent design is. So intelligent design, do you want me to go over fine-tuning or intelligent design? Because there's two slides. Okay, intelligent design is simply this idea that the human makeup is so finely tuned and seems to give that it cannot have been out of chance or randomness. It seems to be perfectly apt to create, it seems to be indicating that there's a pattern or a designer behind the mechanics of how the human body was constructed. So much so that you cannot attribute this as a chance-like thing. For example, if you see, this is a typical example, if you see a watch in the middle of the desert, would you believe that just popped out of existence from chance? No, right? So similarly like that, the complexity of the human biology is so specific. There's some atoms and enzymes and molecules that are so specifically engineered that it's hard to believe these just came out of blind natural processes. It seems like there was a designer who instilled this in the human makeup. That's intelligent design.
Yeah, but they are evolutionists.
Sorry?
But they are evolutionists or not? And intelligent design scientists, are they evolutionists? Do they believe in evolution or not?
They take the evolutionary data. Yes, yeah. They take evolutionary data to make that narrative. It's an alternative explanation to the Darwinian evolution. They don't necessarily reject evolution. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just want to comment.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, the way you define intelligent design, you mean that God is actually intervening in the moment in evolution? Is that what you're saying?
As in like the flagellum, for example. It seems like it has two specific functions to be able to come out of just chaos and randomness and order. It seems that it was gradually conformed into that by a designer. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. That's what I'm saying, yeah. So you got to be careful here. See, if I talk about theology, I'm going to gun down by scholars. If I talk about science, I'm going to gun down by scientists. Astaghfirullah. Very complicated field. Right? Yes.
Another question from a written question from the audience. If God cannot be evil, as in good and evil in this world, is subjective to how God has designated good and evil in this world, how do we understand him to be merciful? As in, a parallel world mercy could be the opposite. So we reject him being evil, but not merciful.
What? Okay, so can I read that question? I think I prefer. So the thing is, when we talk about possible worlds, right? When we talk about God could have created a different world with different mechanics, etc., we're not negating what He said in the Quran for this specific world. If He said He's merciful, how we understand mercy is that He might, out of His grace, forgive us, give us salvation in the next life. That's the point. Merciful, as He says it, it's the idea of, basically it's the akhirah, the salvation in the akhirah. And that's what we're trying to say, that if God says that He will, He's promised that for the believers, the one who do righteous deeds, the one who have the correct iman, etc., they will get X, Y, Z rewards in heaven. The ones who do other things who are bad, they will get these sorts of conclusions in the akhirah. That's all we mean by rahmah. Rahmah is based on what you do and out of the grace of God. Simply as that. Now, if I understood it correctly, she's saying that the idea of merciful might change given another world. That's very plausible, yeah. Merciful could mean another thing in another possible world Allah could have created. No problem.
I think for most people, lay people, the whole purpose of looking into this topic is in terms of evolution and such, is for the preservation of our own iman, because people are raising questions that maybe might be putting doubts in people's hearts. And the original question I had, like you said, both of them are necessary in terms of...
Oh, your question evolved, right?
Yeah. It's just for more clarity, really, is that you said, and I'm sure everybody's in agreement, people need to understand and become an expert in the particular field of science that might be dealing with this issue, and they also need to have the understanding of the Islamic theology axioms. So what I wanted to know from you, from your personal experience being in that field and getting into the depth that you have, would you say it's important for a person to first ensure that they have a full understanding of the Islamic theology axioms, especially the generation coming up now, in terms of young people, prior to delving into these sort of areas? Or do you think it can actually be done in tandem?
Okay. So just out of humility, I would be cautious in using the theological axioms. I would say there's an epistemic scope, and there's room for disagreements in that scope. That would be my first way of addressing that. So you want me to repeat? Yeah. Astaghfirullah. So, okay. So the brother's asked, he's reformulated his question, and he said that from my experience, what would I advise to younger people in terms of trying to come into this field? Is that generally and broadly your question? Great. Okay. So like I said, just out of humility, I would make sure that first people understand that there are nuances. I once studied under Sheikh Ismail. He's an instructor from Al-Kawthar. He's a very funny guy. He was doing the fiqh of burials, but he, mashallah, lit up that course because of his humor, even though it's such a dry subject. And anyways, he said something that really stuck with me. He said, if you want to look for a black and white solution in Islam, you will find it. If you want to find gray areas in Islam, you will also find it. And I think our tradition is very rich. Yeah, I think it's very rich. And there are nuances in that tradition. So the first thing I would say is make sure that when you enter these discussions, do not necessarily expect black and white in everything, right? There are some gray areas, and people have been discussing this for 1400 years, right? You're not going to be the next Einstein in Islamic revolution or something, you know? We have a rich history, we have rich ideas, and it takes time to digest and get that in. Similarly, when you study science, of course it's going to take time. And for example, many of us study maths, right? Basic algebra. Then from there we go into calculus, which I know most of us hate, right? Then we have to do further, computational mechanics, etc. Quantum mechanics is now a big thing. It's one of the most difficult things that you can study in mathematics. All I'm going to try and say is, to wrap up, I think just learn that there are difficulties in each school, in each discipline. You have to take the time and patience to learn them. If you're willing to invest in that, great, then you can enter this field. But if you're going to only come in from one side and then you think you can step out of your zone and start, so for example, if as a scientist I started dictating about theology that astaghfirullah, 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 that's me going outside of my authority. But so in order to at least be able to appreciate a discussion, learn the language of what you're trying to engage with, right? So I take time to be able to understand theology. Bear in mind, I only started really practicing Islam when I was 21. I'm 30 now. I didn't know what Bismillah meant at 21 because I didn't get any proper theological training. It was only during my PhD I realized engineering is not something I wanted to do. It was only afterwards that I realized. And believe it or not, what forced me to come into Islam was my professor who was an atheist. He forced questions on me that I didn't know how to answer. So that caused me to think and go into Islam and study about philosophy, etc. And that's when I realized, wow, we have a rich tradition and I can learn so much. And then from there, I came into this territory. So I would say, have humility, understand that there are nuances. Don't expect black and white answers all the time. It requires hard work. If you're willing to put in that effort, great. That's what you need. Those are the characteristics you need to be able to attain this. Because remember, if you're in one field, right, you pretty much have one line of attack by professionals coming at you. If you're in an interdisciplinary field, and this is highly interdisciplinary, you're going to be critiqued by philosophers, theologians, and scientists. So you got to have thick skin to be able to do that. And you need to be well versed in all three to be able to have your ground. That would be my advice. I really like the works of John Lennox. John Lennox is a Christian apologist. He's a mathematics professor at Oxford University. He's written some of the best books, and he's shaped me quite a lot. John Lennox is somebody I would recommend. I would also recommend somebody called Edward Feser. He's an excellent philosopher of religion. He's written 2 books called The Last Superstition and The 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. We're doing an online course based on the second book. So that's an excellent. Now bear in mind, these guys are Christians at the end of the day. So there might be some territories you might disagree with them, but like in terms of the broad territories of philosophy, science, religion, they've got some excellent stuff. Those are the 4 books I'd recommend for now. Sorry? Sorry? Yeah. So Hamza's sources, he's written The Divine Reality. That's strictly written from an Islamic perspective. That would be one as well, yeah. There's also God, Islam, and the Skeptic Mind, written by 2 Malaysian individuals. So that's also a good book as well from the Islamic perspective.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Shoaib, again for the lecture. My question is regarding the first line there where it says compatibility is possible. I just want to be very clear on what we're referring to as compatible, to which part of evolution. Are we talking about evolution from an adaptation perspective? Are we talking about evolution from a change of kind perspective, or are we talking about both?
It's both, but like I said, the science of it is not a problem. I'm talking about the general principles. In terms of its general principles, does it have a problem with Islam? That's what I'm trying to point out this time. The scientific aspects, with regards to Adam, did he come from a monkey or whatever, etc., that we're going to have that, inshallah, that conversation in July. But I'm saying from a metaphysical, doctrinal perspective, the principles of evolution do not conflict, at least with Islam. Hermeneutically, remember, that's a different discussion altogether. We're going to reserve for July, inshallah.
Yeah, sorry, and just on that point, is it possible to have the doctrinal discussion without the textual references? Because naturally, those form part of our aqeedah.
Sure.
So to do it independently from that is difficult and leaves us sort of with a half.
Sure. I completely, what's it called? I definitely believe that if something is explicit in the text, you reject that, then that you're in a questionable state, right? That's a very questionable position, whether you're a believer or not, etc. That's a clear-cut tenet in all schools, all creedal schools. But if you reject something that has multiple interpretations, polysemous, then that opens up the nuances and discussions. That's why I don't want to touch hermeneutics, because that's a whole baggage that requires its own mechanics and its own conversation. What I'm just trying to say here is, at least from a general aqeedi point of view, not an issue. Whether it's an issue now from a hermeneutic level, inshallah, we'll find out. All right? Like I said, my point here is to just allow people to see nuances. That's my objective. I don't want people to approach Islam as if, it's an atheistic ideology, it's basically clouded by all sorts of negative judgments. I'm saying, look at it from an academic perspective. You're living, most of our kids are going to be taught this at school, whether we like it or not, right? Either at school or university level, it's going to be there. So we have to be able to at least engage some of the areas from a theological perspective and the wider angles as well. That's only my objective here. That's the only thing I'm trying to say.
It's question upon a question that was asked already. For myself, benefit of myself, you mentioned the book of John Lennox.
Yeah.
I've read a few of his works, The God's Undertaker,
yeah,
his rebuttal against Stephen Hawking, etc. And the reason I'm mentioning this, because from a theological perspective, I think it's quite damaging for a Muslim to read these books. And the reason to that is because the Christian doctrine, they anthropomorphize and they give a corporeal figure to God.
Yeah.
And the reason that's a big problem, not just for Muslims, but when we tackle neo-scientists like Richard Dawkins and etc., because according to them, as you alluded in your presentation, hukm adi, the normative rulings from the Ash'ari perspective, the empirical method, which is a scientific method in discovering things, if I'm correct, God, from a Christian perspective, comes under that scope.
Yeah.
Because he has a figure, he's got a corporeal figure, he's got limits.
Yeah.
But our doctrine, like Imam Tahawi, who's more or less everybody agrees on, God is beyond limits and boundaries.
Yes.
La tahwil jihad, to sit the six directions do not encapsulate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah.
So that's a big clash, a very big clash. And I think that's a pivotal clash. And my pivotal critique of John Lennox, I appreciate from a theistic perspective, but from a Muslim perspective, I don't think it's good.
Is that for me or is that for?
That's just a general comment.
Okay.
Is there a book in English, because I'm not, in English academia is not my, I'm unaware. Is there an English book where we can read and understand the argument without putting our creed regarding Allah, which is a very important aqidah, regarding Allah's that, his being, into danger? John Lennox, in my humble opinion, I think that'll do a lot of damage, especially if a person hasn't studied basic aqidah about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah. So the brother has asked a very wonderful question. So he's saying that, can you please recommend other texts which are not infused with Christian theology? Because we are, of course we are brothers and sisters, right, in humanity, but we obviously have theological differences with those brothers and sisters. I mean, that's just going to be there, right? He said that John Lennox has a few theological principles that we may not agree with, and that's correct. I agree with that. I'm just saying that his science stuff is excellent, particularly some of his criticisms of how atheists stamp on science to prove religion wrong. That's all I'm saying. He's one of the best that does that. That's why I supplemented that reading with, for example, Hamza's book, Divine Reality, and the other one, God, Islam, and the Skeptic Mind. That's also a very good book, written by two Muslims. So, and you've mentioned an excellent point. What you highlighted there was, so this entire field, atheism, philosophy of science, religion, is completely dominated by Christian thinkers, philosophers or theologians, right? Completely dominated. Our contribution, I'm talking about as Muslims, is nearly zero. There are only a few books that I could say that that are up to a really good level to be able to compete with that. But otherwise, it's absolutely zero. So, alhamdulillah, some of my colleagues here, we were actually working on a think tank where we're trying to come up with several ideas of publications down the line where Muslims have an alternative, authentic expression based on the various narratives that they occupy. So inshallah, please do make dua first, but that would be my response to you. Barakallahu feek. Yeah.
What I would advise on that, Sheikh Yasir, is since you've been through the Alimiyyah and you've studied the works of Kalam, I would recommend a book by one of the associate professors, or Professor Basil Al-Atai. He's written a work called Daqiqul Kalam, which I haven't read the work, but it's on my reading list, which tries to bring in the modern physics in the ancient, the earlier Middle-aged Kalam. So I would recommend that you get the book Daqiqul Kalam by Professor Basil Al-Atai and Al-Attai, Muhammad Basil Al-Attai.
Sheikh, the pronunciation is not going to be relevant on Google.
Yeah?
I'll just add to that, Dr. Basil has also written another book called God, Cause, and Islam. Really good book. Really, really good book. That would be a very good book to go over. So in that book, he talks about the relationship between science, religion, and even some of the principles that I was talking about. He makes a distinction, for example, the laws of science, the laws of nature and the laws of science. The laws of science are the constructs that humans come up with, but the laws of nature are pretty much iradatullah. That's how he defines it in his book. And then he goes on to a nice sort of integration between kalamic metaphysics and quantum mechanics. Highly recommended.
From a parent from our madrasa, according to some scientists, living things originated from water. Is there a place for such an idea in Islam and science? Yeah. Sheikh Uthman, could you explain?
So is that according to the scientists or according to
according to this note, it says, according to some scientists.
All right, okay. Yes, there is within the scientific community the idea that human beings evolved from, so there was a discovery just past the turn of this millennium, where a fish tiktaalik was discovered, and they believe that that was our ancient ancestor. So going by that tiktaalik is from the sea. So if we evolved from that, then that will be according to what the questioner is asking. And I don't think if the, I mean, these ideas are based on tracing history using paleontological evidence, and it falls within the realm of zan. It's not within the realm of yaqeen. So it falls within the realm of speculation by reconstructing history using paleontological evidence, rather than reconstructing history based on absolute concrete evidence. Inferential. So what do you mean in terms of paleontological?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't put my all eggs in that basket by saying that this is our ancestor, but I'm just quoting it as what the scientists do believe, that human beings came from that fish, and that's our ancestor. Yeah. So what happens is that a lot of times verses of the Quran are retrofitted with what the scientists discover. So I personally don't adhere to that type of narrative where scientist makes a discovery in our time, and then there's a verse in the Quran that's kind of fitted to that discovery, retrofitting the verses to those discoveries. I'm personally not inclined to that type of opinion. It could be that the water here being created by water, in fact that is what the exegetes say, that is the water could be the semen. So instead of saying that we came through our evolutionary ancestry from a tiktaalik to our current time, it could be that the water is in the meanings of semen, and that semen then led to the creation of mankind, and then it came down to us. So that could be another way of looking at that.
Assalamu alaikum. Questions for Sheikh Usman. Again, Jazakallah khair for your lecture. Regarding this golden age that you're referring to, alhamdulillah, is something we look back fondly upon. My question is, from a historic standpoint and your study, why do you think that that era allowed the Muslim and Islamic civilization to be the forefront of science, technology, culture, language, compared to today's age, where we're not contributing hardly anything? What was the single factor, would you say, from a historical standpoint in your study, that was the key for us to be leaders at that time?
Okay, that's a very good question. The brother has asked a question that why is it that during the Islamic golden age of new astronomy, Muslims were able to make those achievements, and why is it in our time today we are not able to make equivalent achievements in the scientific discourse? One of the things that Professor George Saliba mentions in his book, which I was quoting today, is that during the 16th century, around about 15th century to 16th century, there was a major political split within the Islamic world. And that's where we had the Safavids, we had the Ottomans, and we had the Mughals, the three great empires during that time split within the Muslim world. So he pins down the decline of Islamic science to a major split. So, I mean, decline is a relative term in this context. So decline doesn't mean Muslims just plunged down into darkness. They were still progressing, but Europe was relatively quicker in its progress to the Muslim world. So that is one factor that was appealing to me, that it's the split within the Muslim at the level of the Khilafah, that they split into three different groups, which is the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. And then they had their own personal interests and internal rivalries, so they no longer patronized and commissioned science, which was happening during the earlier Islamic civilization, during the Abbasids and Umayyads. So that could be, out of many other factors, one factor that led to the relative decline of the Muslim science compared to the European science.
So what comes first, or I think what came first, chicken or an egg? And then at the back it says, an excellent question. Okay.
The simple answer to that would be consciousness. The fact that she has the conscience to ask that question, that consciousness came first before the chicken and the egg. Oh, did you not say she? Whether it's a male or female consciousness, or God.
Any other
questions? What does the symbol mean, Fatima? Is there anything written in the logo?
Just very briefly, alhamdulillah, we do have a bit of time, so just very briefly, our madrasa is named after someone called Fatima Elizabeth Cates. Now, she was previously known as Frances Elizabeth Cates, and she was one of the first Muslim women, okay, or one of the first females in Victorian Britain to accept Islam. Now, that's according to recorded history, etc. Our madrasa has also a page, just dedicated to research on her with all our primary sources, which we've gathered from the British Library. So you can get more details there. However, just to give you a brief understanding of that, she lived in an era in in Victorian period where there was this movement against banning alcohol, okay, or speaking against alcohol. And she was about 18 years old, and she was also part of that movement. Now, Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam at the time, and based according to the Ottoman Khalifa at the time, he called him the Sheikh al-Islam of the British Isles. He was looking at ways to give da'wah in Liverpool at the time. So one of the ways he kind of plugged in his understanding and his explanation on Islam was through various movements that were taking place in Victorian Britain at the time. So there was a lecture that was going to take place, or many lectures used to take place against alcohol. So what Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam did was, he went to the movement and he said that he wanted to talk about this from a Muslim perspective. And the lecture that he gave is now in a form of a book, which you can get a PDF of online. It's called Fanatics and Fanaticism. So he was referring to the companions, the Sahaba of Prophet ﷺ. So he came along and he gave this lecture in this hall full of 99% Christians or atheists. And there was just actually there was only one other Muslim at the time in Liverpool. And by chance, he was sitting next to Frances Elizabeth, who later became Fatima Elizabeth. And after hearing the lecture, she turned to him and said, "Look, I'm amazed, right? I cannot believe that Mohammedans also reject alcohol. I want to know more about Islam." And later he got her in touch with Abdullah Quilliam, who gave her a copy of his own Quran. Okay. And it was in English. She took this copy home, and once she got home, her mum asked, "What is this in your hand?" Because books were not so cheap back then. And she said, "This is the Mohammedan Bible." And based on that, she ran after her and said, "Look, I don't want this in my house. Throw this out of my house into the rubbish." And she ran up into her room. She had to lock her room. And then she began reading the Quran in English from the front cover all the way till the back. And then she came out of the room. And at that time, she had accepted Islam just off her research or just off her reading of the English translation of the Quran. However, after that, and then she became Muslim, she was also the first secretary in the first mosque or the first masjid in Britain, in Liverpool. And not only that, she went through a lot of sacrifices. And that's why we were inspired by her. And I'll come to the end of the logo. She was, when she went out into the streets, she could not leave her Quran in the house because her mum would destroy it. So she would walk everywhere in Liverpool with the Quran in her hand, everywhere. So can you imagine that image of Fatima Elizabeth walking everywhere with the Quran in her hand 130 years ago? And then when she used to walk outside, there were times, and she describes this herself, which came in the Allahabad Review in India, and her conversion story. She describes how at times she was, they should throw rubbish at her, Okay, all the garbage that was thrown at her. At the same time, there was a time when she was pinned down. And at the time, there were no cars, okay? And we're at the moment in Frederick Bremer School, who was known to be one of the first people to, have a say in the invention of cars. So at that time, there were no cars. So there was a lot of, animal waste everywhere. That was taken, and that was, rubbed all over her. Can you imagine? I mean, it's easy to say that in words and for her to just write in text. But can you imagine the difficulty she went through? I came across, as part of my research on Fatima Elizabeth, and it was an accidental way of getting to her, was her divorce petition. She wrote, imagine, in Victorian era, when women did not have much of a say, she was writing a divorce petition against her husband. She accepted Islam, by the way, at the age of 18. She passed away at 31. And she is writing a divorce petition against her husband, which is full 18 pages in her own writing. And you can access that on our website. So, by the way, so she went through a lot. And we're still trying to find out more about her. Mainly because I don't feel the academics out there have the patience to go out there, deeply search. With people like Abdullah Quilliam, there is so much available out there. There's all those secondary sources on him, and there's so much more we can find out. However, individuals like Fatima Elizabeth, I think they were the epitome of faith in early Britain, in early Islam in Britain. And that's why we're hoping that we can try and, contribute to, Fatima Elizabeth becoming more known in the Muslim community. Yeah, and this is something that we want to work on. Now, unfortunately, when she was 31, so she went through a lot of hardships in her life. And like I mentioned, the whole divorce thing, and that was after her husband had accepted Islam as well. Okay, that's the interesting thing. He passed away before that anyway. But towards the end of her life, she had influenza. She got a bit better, but then she kind of felt she was passing away, and she sent for someone to call Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, because he was the one who introduced Islam to her. And in his presence, she lifted her finger. So that's basically her finger. Lifted her finger towards the skies, and she said the Shahada, and she passed away. And this whole story of her passing and how her, burial took place in Anfield, her grave is there. We're still, inshallah, hoping to search for it. She passed away, and that also was an article in one of the newspapers in Manchester, which I was able to access in the British Library. So she has been through a lot. Okay, I've just mentioned some very briefly. And a lot of what I mentioned is from her own story that she describes. And she's written a few poems. I found out that she, when the camera was introduced, she got one. She came to London. I mean, this is small nuggets that we're able to find from here and there. There's not much on her, but inshallah. Sorry? This is, we're talking 1890, 1880, she was around that time. And she was a dressmaker, something I found out from the census, which she filled out. So, I mean, there's also the case where her husband used to beat her with, the tongs at the time, which were there to, adjust the coal in the fireplaces. And they used to be big. She was beaten by that. She was almost killed by being strangled, and this, I think, was prior to him accepting Islam, where she had to break the window of her house. She had to break that window, and there was one of the rooms in that house was rented out to actually 2 students from India who had come all the way from India to study in the University of Liverpool. So for us, that's Fatima Elizabeth, and that's one of the reasons why, for instance, we are trying to focus on trying to give access to our students to at least the English text of the Quran, being inspired by Fatima Elizabeth. And our logic behind that is, out of the 100% of the students who do study in a madrasa, it's usually just the 1% who go further to study Arabic, and we wish them all the best in that journey. However, what about the 99% who are not going to go through that journey? How are they going to access the Quran? So at least to have some kind of hermeneutical structure in place for them to be able to access the Quran in English, even though it's difficult to be able to do that. So that answered the question. In short, it was her finger as she was passing away. Yes, like this, yeah. Any other? Yes. Oh, Jazakallah. Any last questions for speakers? Okay.